Today's video is a double-packed doozy, pun intended. We have a list of twins joined by their butts seemingly, and a pair of twins kidnapped a few times. With that said, here are the weirdest conjoined twins. We're gonna start our list off today with Helen and Judith, the Hungarian sisters. We start our list off today with a rather risque, funny-looking... Well, either way, it's unfortunate to see these two, and even worse when you hear about how their bond affected the two. These are Helen and Judith, two conjoined twins with a rather storied history. It's stated that these two girls were born 3 hours apart from one another, though it is hard to say if that's a fact or not. Now, what is a fact is that the girls were born with their pelvises fused together, giving them the impression they sort of share a butt. While the image itself can be funny, the actual effects are pretty severe, with the duo suffering through a lot, including a stroke for Judith at age 6. This stroke left her paralyzed on her left side. Despite the problems, however, they did live an interesting life, learning several languages as well as becoming performers, singing for captive audiences. Despite this small bit of fame, the two decided to live in privacy until they passed, the same day at the tender age of 22. We then move on to Giovanni and Giacomo Toshi. Born in Lucena, Italy, Giovanni and Giacomo are twins joined from the waist up, giving them the appearance they were actually conjoined by the chest. These two are a strange case, as they're both in control of only one leg each. This caused them to have some problems actually walking. Instead, the two opted to crawl everywhere as it was simply easier for them. A rumor was that when they were born, their father couldn't handle it. Apparently took one look at his sons and went crazy, being forcefully sent to a mental asylum for about a month. After that, the twins were mainly taken around and shown in impromptu freak shows for cash, which took up a very large portion of their childhood. Finally, though, in 1891, they came to America, where they continued to be put up for exhibition. The two eventually returned to Venice, where they entered early retirement and secluded themselves away from the public, more than likely tired of the constant attention for all the wrong reasons. While their passing date isn't exactly known, it's generally agreed they passed shortly after 1912. Then we come to the Orisa Sisters. Radika and Dudika Niek have one heck of a depressing upbringing, as when they were born, the inhabitants of the village saw them as an omen and called for their separation. In fact, their father was ready to separate them himself, which probably would not have gone well in the slightest. The twins were born conjoined by a band of thick cartilage, which, yeah, if their father just took a blade to it, it would not have ended well for anyone. I think also others did see that it wouldn't go well as well, so instead they were sent to a monastery in the region. There they stayed until the head of a show train named Captain Coleman purchased them and showed them off, dubbing them the Hindu Twins. They stayed in that business for a good chunk of time, but gained some real attention in 1902 when Dudika developed tuberculosis. Finally, the two were separated, mainly for the sake of Radika. We then come to the Byzantine Twins. No name for these two, simply a title of the Byzantine Twins. These two were born in the early 10th century and were reported to have been born and were described as having the various parts of their bodies were whole and complete, but the sides were attached from the armpit to the hip, uniting their bodies and combining them into one. And with the adjacent arms, they embraced each other's necks, and in the other carried staffs, on which they supported themselves as they walked. That is a quote from one of the several chronicles written about the duo. The two were known to wander great distances, wandering around the countryside of Constantinople and keeping to themselves. This continued on until one twin died, and the other sought to have the literal dead weight removed. While the resulting surgery was a success, the remaining twin reportedly only lived about 3 more days before passing away himself. We then move on to Violet and Daisy Hilton. Joined at the pelvis, yet sharing 0 organ functions, we come to Violet and Daisy Hilton, a pair of conjoined twins born in the 1900s Britain. Born to a poor barmaid mother, they were sold to Mary Hilton, who, much like our other entries on this list, were touted around and shown on exhibition, going around, singing and dancing to people's content as they traveled through Europe and the good old US of A. The two did live a rather interesting and sometimes intense life, admittedly, as when Mary passed away, the ownership of the twins fell to Mary's daughter and son-in-law. However, the twins ended up suing the two, not only gaining their freedom, but also $100,000 in the process, which back in 1931 was a pretty penny to say the least. The two went on to star in several acts and even 2 movies in their time, before finally succumbing to the flu in 1969. We then move on to Margaret and Mary Gibb. Another story of unexpected events, we come to the Gibb twins, girls born conjoined at the hips at the base of their spine. The two were born in 1912 Massachusetts, and unlike most of the other entries' parents and caretakers, Margaret and Mary's parents didn't want them exploited. They also respected the girls' wishes to stay together, even after several doctors offered to do the operations. The girls were homeschooled, and at the age of 14, the two decided to go on their own. They headed off to New York to perform shows in front of audiences, as well as work for a few different circuses. The two seemed to love the limelight, with Margaret having been in the papers for a few reported marriages and separations, and yet none of this ever did come to pass. Despite the limelight love, their last few years were generally quiet, before Margaret was sadly diagnosed with cancer. Both twins decided to stay together even in the face of this, with the twins dying within minutes of one another. We then come to Chang and Ang Bunker. Hailing from good old Thailand, we have a pair of twins who actually helped encourage the term Siamese twins, that being Chang and Ang Bunker. Right from birth, their lives were already in danger, as the king of Siam himself ordered them to be killed. Thankfully, their lives were saved by their loving mother. And now it's time for the mandatory non-Gibb children treatment. I'm talking, of course, that a British man saw them, thought they were pretty neat-so, and lured them to England with the promise of not dying in poverty in exchange for their dignity. Honestly, pretty standard at this point for this story. The two left their home as teenagers and went on to tour around England and the US, exhibiting their special gift for all to see. Now, despite that usual setup though, Chang and Ang actually set out on their own at age 21, and found it to be quite lucrative. They toured around, made some pretty big bucks, enough to retire to a nice farm and also married two nice sisters. Also, these two fathered a few children. 21, in fact. 21! Ugh, man, that's just... ugh. Either way, the two eventually did pass away at the age of 60, passing away within minutes of one another. It's sad, yes, but it seems like they at least had a better life than a lot of our other entries on this list. Speaking of, we come to Millie and Christine McCoy. North Carolina natives Millie and Christine McCoy were born in 1851 to a family owned by slavers. God, I thought Chang and Ang had a bad beginning. Thankfully, though, their owner didn't seem to care too much for them, or their mother, and then sold them to John Purvis, owner of a traveling circus, who then sold them to another showman named Joseph Pearson Smith, where they were then kidnapped by yet another showman, and then returned to Pearson. God, that was a roller coaster and a half. The twins had talents for singing in perfect harmony, pleasing many a person at the time. The two did go through a few design changes as time went on, at first just being billed as twins, then as the two-headed girl, and were also legally renamed Millie Christine to reflect them being one person. The two earned a good amount of money and retired at the age of 58, when slavery was far past being gone, and then lived on until they died at the respectable age of 61 to tuberculosis. We then have Simplico and Lucio Godina. Combined at the pelvis at the spine, Simplico and Lucia were Filipino natives born in 1908. The boys were put up for exhibition mostly by their parents, but were shortly thereafter adopted at ages 11 by Teodor Yengio, who took the boys in and raised them in comfort, amazingly. Maybe it's my cynicism talking, but I expected this to go south. But apparently the boys had the lap of luxury under Teodor, and even went on to marry twin daughters. Despite living in luxury, the family of four decided to tour, impressing audiences with their singing and dancing skills as so many other twins had before them. They seemed to live a rather peaceful and happy life. Sadly though, that would all come to an end when Lucio fell ill with pneumonia in his 30s. While surgery was performed to save the two, Lucio ended up passing away, with his twin dying nearly 2 weeks later. Which shows two twins joined at the chest. They share a pair of legs, but it would appear they split off once they get to their stomachs, showing an extreme case of parasitic twin syndrome. Is this real? Well, find out next with Shivram and Shivnath Sahu. These two were conjoined twins born in Kainia Gram Panchat and were joined at the waist, sharing a pair of legs and stomach, but each having their own set of hearts, lungs, brains, able to function on their own. Born to a farmer, the two suffered some pretty severe health problems, and yet they faced life with a smile and an air of confidence. Their parents actually said of the boys, "Destiny is in God's control." Despite facing challenging disabilities, Shivnath and Shivram nurtured positive outlooks towards life. They were rarely seen depressed watching others walking or running. Both happily moved along with the collaborating efforts on their especially made tricycle. The two were quite popular in the region as well, being well known around by several people, so it came as a shock to many when the two fell badly ill. The twins were 20 years old when they came down with what seemed to be a severe cold, and while medical attention was issued, the boys succumbed to their conditions, ending two gentle souls. A sad note to go out on, I know, but that is our video for today, folks. I do hope you enjoyed it. Which pair of twins was the most interesting? And did we miss any? Well, let us know in the comment section down below. With all that said and done, I will see you all next time. Later, everybody.